Well, hello friends, guys and girls from Spanish Libertarian. Here is Ignacy. As you can see today we are not talking in Spanish, we are talking in English because we want this project and these interviews to be worldwide. And today I have the pleasure to having here with me the American economist Dan Mitchell. Dan, how are you doing?
I am doing just fine. How are you?
I'm fine. Springtime is here, every day is more sunny, so life is nice, hopefully.
Yes.
Okay, I met you this like 2 months ago in Prague and also last year in Montenegro, and you were talking about many different topics that I consider interesting, basically about fiscal policies, taxes and spending, and you also explained, like, I think super briefly and clear how some parts of the world grow economically and they achieve prosperity, and I would like you to talk about that. But first of all, the first question that we always make is like, if you can introduce yourself, at least professionally, for the ones who don't know you, and then we will be talking about different topics. So when you want.
Well, my name is Dan Mitchell. I'm with the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, which is an internationally oriented free market think tank in the United States. I've been in the think tank world my whole life, including at the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and I briefly worked for a U.S. Senator on Capitol Hill. I got my PhD from George Mason University, which of course is well known around the world for its many different schools of thought in the free market sphere of economics. So I think I got some good training and good background from George Mason. But I've always had libertarian leanings, in part for the moral reason that I think we want to minimize the amount of government coercion in society.
Okay, so if you want, let's just start with that. I mean, why were you interested about these topics, and why restraining the government interference in our life is good for us? So let's say I don't know nothing about this. How could you explain it for me?
For most people, the discussion is very utilitarian. What type of society generates more prosperity? So when I'm talking to an audience of business leaders, if I'm talking to some politicians or policymakers in a government, for the most part, I'll simply do these comparisons where I'll say, well, you have some societies with very large governments with lots of intervention, and they just don't grow as fast. They're not as prosperous. They don't deliver as good results. So I'll compare those societies to societies where government is much more limited in size, and you have low tax burdens, low burdens of government spending, less red tape. And I'll simply make the argument that if we care about the well-being, the material prosperity of ordinary people, then yes, we want to have free markets and small government. It boils down to just that simple phrase right there. But there are, of course, other components. You need a rule of law, open trade, open capital markets, but basically free markets and small government is the simplest way of describing that kind of society that tends to deliver much better results for ordinary people. Now, I'm a libertarian. I also have a moralistic streak to me about wanting people not to be subjected to arbitrary government coercion. I want people to be the owners of the income that they earn and not have to turn over enormous amounts of their money to the government. I view governments as fundamentally corrupt for reasons that the public choice school of economics teaches us, that special interest groups capture the machinery of government, and those special interest groups wind up using government to line their pockets in ways that are unfair and unjust. So part of me is very much motivated by the philosophical principles of libertarianism, of minimizing government coercion, people having the maximum freedom in their lives. But in the world of sort of policy making, I oftentimes rely on the utilitarian arguments that I described earlier.
I know you're an expert about the fiscal policy and on taxes and spending. Is there any like preferable size of the role of government? I mean, I guess you're not an anarchist, but so what's the equilibrium more or less the government should be in like the legitimate role of government in order to be more efficient and moral for individuals?
There's actually a lot of academic research about that very question. The issue you're asking about is basically called the Ron curve. And the notion is that there are some things that government does that actually contribute to economic growth, providing rule of law, defending against foreign aggression, controlling and reducing crime, so maintaining an effective police and court system. Now, some of my anarcho-capitalist friends say, "Oh, the private sector can do that," and maybe it can. But as of right now, there's no society where the private sector is allowed to do those things. So let's just assume government is the one that's going to provide those core public goods of rule of law, national defense, police, so on and so forth. Historically, nations have been able to provide all those things while consuming less than 10% of the private economy. So you can have governments of 5 to 10% of GDP provide all those core public goods. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the history of the Western world, when did North America and Western Europe become rich nations? They became rich during the 1800s and early 1900s when government was very small, when the total burden of government spending was only about 10% of GDP, and in several nations, closer to 5% of GDP. Now, if you look at the modern academic research on what's called the Ron curve, you tend to get results of about 20% of GDP. Now, I suppose I should be happy with those numbers because even in the United States, which is considered to be a small government economy compared to Western Europe, even in the United States, government is consuming 35% of GDP when you look at the national, state, and local levels all combined, which of course is how you should measure it. Well, should I be happy? Because yes, let's reduce government from 35% to 20% of GDP. That would be a huge improvement. And it would obviously be a giant improvement in some Western European countries where government is consuming 45 or 50% of GDP. However, I'm a libertarian, and also I believe in data. And so if you were to ask me, well, if government is best at 20% of GDP, doesn't that imply that government should have been much bigger in the 1800s and early 1900s? And of course, I don't think that's right. So I actually think the reason that academics get this answer of 20% of GDP is they're dealing with very limited data points. If you're a researcher and you're trying to collect data to measure what is the growth maximizing size of government, because that's what the Ron curve is all about, you're basically limited to data in the post-World War II era because the data before then is very sparse and probably not sufficiently robust to do a lot of academic research. So if you're looking at data in the post-World War II era, and probably even more from like 1960 on, there are no genuinely small government economies. The smallest governments that you'll find in the developed world today are in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, where government consumes about 20% of GDP. So is it any surprise that modern academic researchers, when they try to measure the Ron curve, they basically conclude 20% of GDP is the growth maximizing level? But I think that simply is a reflection of the fact that there's only a couple of data points, Hong Kong and Singapore. So what other results are you going to get? It would be great if we had really good data going back in the 1800s. I think we'd find that the Ron curve, the growth maximizing point on the Ron curve, was more like 5 to 10% of GDP. But maybe that's just pedantic libertarian grousing. I mean, if we got to 20% of GDP, I would be very happy compared to where we are right now.
Continuing with this topic, there's a Spanish economist called Juan Ramon Rayo, and he always asks himself what is more preferable, to cut taxes or to cut public spending. And I'm asking you directly this question: if you had to pick up one, which one would you pick up? Which one would you think that is more preferable for the citizen?
In the long run, there's no question the fundamental, the profound fiscal challenge in Western societies is that government is too big. It's too big, consuming too much of the private economy. It's too big, creating too much dependency and eroding the societal capital of self-reliance and the work ethic and things like that. So yes, there's no doubt we have to control and reduce the size of government. Now, having said that, how do we do it? Uh, we obviously, as libertarians, we don't do a very good job about this. Now, there is a debate. It's basically the starve the beast hypothesis. Well, maybe we can actually control government spending if we cut taxes. And if we cut taxes and put government on a diet in terms of how much money it takes out of the private economy, maybe that will force them to control government spending. And there's a lot of debate with some libertarians on both sides of that issue. Uh, I'll simply observe that the major study that a lot of people cite, and they say, oh, this study from Romer and Romer disproves the starve the beast hypothesis. If you actually read the study, which I've done and I've written about it on my blog, well, the reason that the starve the beast hypothesis doesn't work is because when politicians cut taxes, they within 5 years they turn around and raise taxes. So it's sort of like saying, oh, you went on a diet, but you didn't lose weight because you kept eating. Well, of course you didn't lose weight. You kept eating. You don't go on a diet for 2 days and then go to an all-you-can-eat restaurant. That's not how it works. So I'm in favor of cutting taxes. I mean, don't get me wrong. Anywhere for, I think Milton Friedman had some famous quote that he favors tax cuts anywhere, anytime, for any reason. However, going back to what I said to initially answer your question, we have to figure out some way of controlling the growth of government spending. If we don't do that, sooner or later, taxes will just go up and up and up and up. So I don't know, is this a chicken or egg problem? What do you have to do first? I guess I'm somewhat ecumenical on that. I want to reduce and control government spending any way I can, and I want to try to lower the tax burden any way I can.
You were mentioning the role of libertarians in all the public scene and all the important topics such as this. And you ask, honestly, like, how do you do that? Am I asking you this precise question? Do you think that libertarians, let's say, are we having enough influence in policymakers, or what we should do in order to be more influential on the policies that are being applied?
Well, to be honest, if you look at the results, if you look at what governments are doing around the world, libertarians are doing a lousy job. And when I say libertarians are doing a lousy job, I guess I have to put myself at the top of the list, because my job is trying to educate and convince policymakers to do two different things. Now, to be fair, I'd like to think that my whole life isn't a failure. I'd like to think that maybe government would have grown even faster if it wasn't for libertarian think tanks and libertarian organizations and libertarian writers and analysts and economists. So maybe we're having some positive effect, and that the world would be in much worse shape today if it wasn't for libertarians and classical liberals and small government conservatives and other people who are our allies in this fight to control government. But there's no question it would be wonderful if we could figure out ways of being more effective. But this is one of the reasons, I suppose this is a good time to bring this up. One of the reasons I believe in having a very international focus is because the world is a laboratory. And if you look at the countries, the jurisdictions that have managed to keep government more under control, if you look at Singapore and Hong Kong, and you look at how much faster they grow and how much more prosperous their societies are than the places where government is very big. I mean, you look at the economic stagnation in Italy and Greece. Look at the utter economic misery in places like North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela. The bigger government gets, the more it's intervening in the economy, the worse the results are. So I think the international evidence is probably our strongest hand, our strongest evidence that we can provide to the world. Because whenever I'm doing debates with my friends on the left, and I say, okay, well, here's my big list of all these countries that are growing faster because they've reduced the size of government. Now show me your list. But there's nothing. They have an empty page. Especially when you're looking at several decades of data. And I'm a big believer in this. In any one year, you can find some statistical anomaly where a free market economy might have a recession. You can find 1 year where a government-controlled economy has good growth. But when you're looking at 10, 20, 30 years of data, it it always becomes very, very clear that the market-oriented economies, the economies with more limited government, do better, grow faster. And this is probably the big thing that I have to try to convince people of. If you actually care about what's in the best interest of lower income people, there's no substitute for economic growth. It's better to be a poor person in Hong Kong where there's no welfare state than it is to be a poor person in France where there's a big welfare state. Because at least in Hong Kong, you have a much, much better chance of climbing out of poverty. Whereas in a country with a big welfare state, the best you can hope for, at least in the overwhelming number of cases, the best you can hope for is that the government's simply going to take care of you, but your life will never get better.
You were mentioning my friends in the left, and I agree with that. I don't think we don't have to have enemies. But when you are in an intellectual discussion, because I know you are in the public scene, I always have this question to me, and I would like to ask it to you. When someone is supporting something that it doesn't work, let's say socialism, state economy, do you think they do it with bad intentions, or they are lying to himself or theirself, sorry, or it's a mixture of that? I don't know if you get my point.
I understand what you're saying because it's a mystery to me as well. I would say the vast majority of ordinary people who identify as being on the left are confusing good intentions with good results. That they genuinely care, I think, about poor people. And therefore they think, well, somehow it has to be good and it somehow will work if we have big government programs to do a lot of redistribution. They're in effect, they're thinking with their heart, not their head. And when I come across people like that, and again, I think the majority of people on the left are in this category. They're honest, they're well-meaning, they just don't understand economics, they don't understand the data, they haven't looked at the history of it. Now, having said that, I think there are plenty of people in governments, I think there are plenty of special interest groups that sort of feed off the government that are totally amoral or even immoral. In other words, they're viewing it simply as a way of accumulating power, of getting unearned wealth. To them, it's just a game, a scam. That they want to try to simply get as much as they can from the system. And those are the people who I think are the bad people. I don't think ordinary people with left-wing sympathies are bad people. I just don't think they understand things. But the closer you get to government, the more likely you are to find people who genuinely are, as I said, either amoral or immoral.
Well, I agree with your reflection, and it's pretty sad. But anyway, changing of topic, you were mentioning before that the world is a laboratory on itself, and I think that's an interesting concept. What can we learn from some laboratories, for example, Asia or China for the last 25 years, or Eastern Europe, post-communist countries that they are embracing capitalism? Their rates of growth are astonishingly growing. I mean, what can we learn from the United States or from the Western Europe where I live?
Well, this is actually a complicated question to answer. And the first thing I always do whenever I'm talking about a specific country is I always look at the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World, because that, in effect, gives the total grade for economic policy for a country. And one of the things you'll notice is that there are 5 major categories that determine whether a country is considered, free market or not. There's fiscal policy, there's trade policy, regulatory policy, monetary policy, and then I think they call it legal system and property rights. I just call it quality of governance, I think is the easiest way to think about it. Well, here's the challenge. Because you have these 5 major categories that determine the level of economic freedom in a country, it's possible that a country can be relatively economically free while doing very poorly in one area. And the classic example of this are the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, places like that. Now, a lot of people think, oh, those are socialist countries. Well, they're not. Socialism technically means government ownership of the means of production. Now, those are countries with big welfare states. They have relatively high tax burdens. They have lots of redistribution, but they're very free market oriented in terms of the allocation of resources. What businesses succeed, what businesses fail. They're very good on having low levels of regulation. They're very good about having open trade. The quality of governance is very high. Their monetary policy regimes are very stable with low inflation. So when you look at the economic freedom of the world rankings, and I think they rank 159 countries, the Nordic countries are some of the highest ranked in the world. You know, places like Finland and Denmark are routinely in the top 20. So they're not socialist in the sense of like Italy or Greece, and they're certainly not socialist in the sense of North Korea or Cuba or Venezuela. So there's really a couple of things. What technically is the definition of socialism? Because a lot of people just think socialism means a big welfare state. Well, technically, that's not true. And then other people, when they're looking at socialism, they only look at fiscal policy, which I'm a fiscal policy economist, so I think that's very important. But there are all these other categories that are described in economic freedom of the world that matter as well. And let me. I guess I'll close this part with a comparison. The the size of government in India is much smaller than the size of government in Denmark. But Denmark is a much more market-oriented economy. Because the one area where Denmark is bad, fiscal policy, that's the one area where India is good. And I don't even think India is good on it, just the government's so incompetent it doesn't manage to collect enough money to have a big welfare state. But if you look at those other four areas, quality of governance, monetary policy, trade policy, regulatory policy, Denmark is far, far more free market oriented than India. So we don't want to just look at the size of government, even though that's what I spend a lot of my day doing. We want to look at all the different economic policies that determine a country's prosperity.
So I guess you're saying that, as you were mentioning, that size does matter, no, as they say, size does matter, it doesn't matter. But what is more important is the ideas and the values of the role of government, the rule of law, etc. Is that what you're meaning?
Well, what I'm saying is that if you have too much government spending and high taxes, that's not a good idea. But if you also happen to have very free market oriented monetary policy, regulatory policy, trade policy, and you have very high quality governance in your country, then you can still grow. You can still be relatively prosperous. And of course, the Nordic countries are an example of that. As a matter of fact, probably the biggest advantage that the Western world, think North America, Western Europe, or Europe in general, and the Pacific Rim, the big advantage that the Western world has is high quality governance. We tend not to have, if you look at Latin America, you look at Africa, the giant problem in those parts of the world isn't that the welfare state is too big. The problem in those parts of the world is that the governments are fundamentally corrupt, and governments have enormous control over what businesses are allowed to operate, whether entrepreneurs have the freedom to innovate. So when I look at those 5 variables in economic freedom of the world, I sometimes think of quality of governance as like the foundation of a house. Now you can have the nicest looking house in the world. You can have beautiful bedrooms and kitchens and living rooms and things like that. But if your house is built on a very bad foundation, it's probably not going to last very long. And so quality of governance that legal system property rights measure in economic freedom of the world, in some sense, that's the first among equals, because all 5 variables count for 20% of a nation's grade. But I actually think the quality of governance is the foundation. And then on that foundation, you have monetary policy, trade policy, regulatory policy, and fiscal policy. And the Western world's biggest advantage in the global economy is that, yes, sure, our governments are too big. We sometimes have too much regulation, but by global standards, we have the best quality of governance. And in other words, the rule of law I think is better in Western societies, and that's why I'm happy to live in the United States. I should wave a little American flag and say I'm a proud American. But you know what? If I was going to live someplace else, I would much rather live in high tax Western Europe than low tax Africa. Because yes, I might pay less money to the government if I lived in Africa, but I wouldn't have nearly as much economic liberty because of all the other things that go in the wrong direction in Africa. Whereas I would have economic freedom in terms of regulation and trade and things like that if I lived in Western Europe.
Continue talking about this. I know you are very critic with the role of IMF, for example, and I guess you are also a critic with global aim. How do you feel about I don't know, globalization or the reduction of poverty in the world? Talking about this, do you think that do you feel positive about this or negative? Do you think that these African countries, so to speak, they will embrace the capitalism and the personal liberty ideas, or it would take for a lot of time? I don't know.
I'm a huge fan of globalization because I'm a huge fan of open trade. That's the easy part of the answer. Unfortunately, I think some people get a little bit confused. They think that if you're pro-globalization, then you have to be pro-international organizations. No, not at all. The international bureaucracies like the IMF or the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they're actually good on some issues like trade. They tend to be for open trade and things like that. But the IMF and the OECD and some of these other international bureaucracies, their main goals in terms of public policy are to push for higher taxes and bigger government. In other words, probably the simplest way to think about it is they want all countries to be like the Nordic countries, which in the grand scheme of things is not a bad answer. If I'm Brazil, I'd rather be Sweden. If I'm Pakistan, I'd rather be Finland. But the Nordic model does have these very high tax rates, very large redistributive welfare states that undermine initiative and the work ethic and things like that. That's not what we should be trying to push on the rest of the world. If you take all these developing countries that have big problems with the rule of law, they have big problems with too much cronyism, they have big problems with government corruption and things like that, and you tell them, which is what the IMF and OECD do, you tell them, oh, you should have high taxes in a big welfare state. That's gonna in effect weigh them down and prevent them from ever becoming rich countries. And here's something I probably should have pointed out earlier. The Western world became rich when government was very, very small. I mean, we already touched on this a little bit when I mentioned that that the total burden of government spending was only 5 to 10% of GDP in Western societies in the 1800s and early 1900s. Well, that's when Western societies went from agricultural poverty to middle class prosperity. And even once you began to get government getting bigger in like the 1930s, well, even then, government was still relatively small, maybe 20% of GDP. It really wasn't until the 1960s that you got the large welfare states that you now find, especially in a lot of Western European countries. Now, it's no coincidence in my mind that Western economies now grow slower. Yeah, we still do pretty good on rule of law and other variables, but the fiscal burden of government has become very large. And yeah, now we're growing at 2% a year instead of 3 or 4% a year. I think part of the explanation of that is that government has gotten bigger, but at least we became rich first. We became rich countries when government was very, very small. Then we adopted these big welfare states. We're now growing slower. Well, here's the problem with the IMF and OECD. They want the developing world to adopt these welfare states before they ever become rich. So in effect, the recipe that the IMF and OECD are trying to give to developing countries is a recipe that will ensure that they never become rich and prosperous. So then the question is, why would they give bad advice? Well, I think the honest answer is that at least in part, the OECD and the IMF, they're controlled by the rich Western nations. The rich Western nations, at least the politicians in those nations, don't want competition. And that's why you see the IMF and the OECD being against tax competition. You see them trying to shut down tax havens. That they want, in effect, to make sure that there's not fiscal competition against their uncompetitive high tax systems. So in my mind, there's good globalism and there's bad globalism. Good globalism is free trade. Good globalism is people and goods and technology and innovation going all across the planet. Good globalism is people getting to know each other more and learning to live peacefully with each other. That's good globalism. Bad globalism is when international bureaucracies try to, in effect, rig the rules of the game to protect the uncompetitive high tax economies of the developed world. And I think that's not only bad economics, that's immoral. We should allow the developing world to follow the same recipe that the United States followed to become rich, that Germany followed to become rich, that Sweden followed to become rich, because all the rich countries of the world became rich when government was very, very small. And so why not allow other countries to enjoy that growth as well?
Well, Daniel, you said your point very clear. So I guess the last question of this topic is what should the think tanks, because I know you've been involved with this, what should the think tanks do about this topic? I mean, how can we influence policymakers? I know I asked you before, but in the specific of this point, because you stated very clear.
I wish I had a good answer to your question, because if I knew, we have a saying in the United States that if you have like a silver bullet, it means that you have the perfect answer, the single thing that could solve a problem. Well, if I had that silver bullet, I would already be firing it. All I can say is that somehow in the think tank world, among the activist community, we need to do a better job of somehow getting this information across to ordinary people. A lot of the politicians are hopeless because they're the amoral or immoral people I discussed before. They want big government just because it increases their power. It enables them to sort of skim some of the money off for their own pockets. I mean, I don't think we can ever convince them to do the right thing, because many of them probably understand the right thing, but they don't care because it's not in their personal self-interest. But for the majority of honest, well-meaning people on the left, I think that if we somehow could explain to them and get across to them that the best way to help low-income people, the best way to help poor countries become rich countries, the best way to create upward mobility for the less fortunate in society, if we could convince our left-wing friends that free markets and limited government were the right recipe to make all those things happen, I think we could potentially, hopefully, win some of these battles. Because if you get enough ordinary people understanding and believing the right thing, then every so often you'll get a good government that will do the positive reforms that are necessary.
Well, Dan, I completely agree. I think that the battle is in the average common people and winning the cultural battle. The last question, at least, that I have, I know you are an American. I'm sure you know a lot of deeply your own country. I would like to ask you, like, the big picture of how do you think the United States is doing these days? You know, here from Europe, we identify United States like the home of the brave, the land of the free, in the place that you can achieve the American dream. But lately you identify United States like the place where the safe spaces are being born, microaggressions, cultural appropriation, and all these strange concepts. I mean, how do you see these days your country? The land of the free and the home of the prosperity is also the home of the super entitled millennials. I mean, how is it going to end? I know it's a big question, but I think you got my point.
Boy, that's a tough question to answer, because 30 years ago, I never would have imagined we would have this society where everyone has to be hypersensitive, and you have issues like cultural appropriation, like you can't appreciate and incorporate features from other cultures into your own society. I mean, to me, imitation is the highest form of flattery. It's great that that in the United States we have this melting pot society where we bring so much of the rest of the world into our country. So I don't know, I view this as almost a this crazy balkanization of American society. But the good news is, I think for 90% of Americans, that's a foreign concept. You find it in universities, and you find it maybe with with government, but for ordinary people, whether they're black or white or Hispanic, whether they're Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or anything else, the vast majority of Americans live normal lives where they go to each other's restaurants, they appreciate each other's cultures. Uh, you know, I think there are lots of problems in the United States, but I guess I'm still nonetheless an optimist because ordinary people are still basically good. And when I say that they're basically good, it means that they think it's not right to steal from their neighbors. It's not right to oppress other people. They want the best for the world. Now, sometimes they might be misguided on economics, but that's my fault for not doing a better job of educating them. Now, you didn't ask about Donald Trump. That's a whole separate issue, and I still am trying to wrap my head around what exactly the Trump presidency means, because he does some things I like on things like taxes and regulation, but then he does some really crazy stuff on trade where we're in danger of going back to tit for tat protectionism that characterized the 1930s. And also, he's a big spender, so he's sort of like a classic populist where he wants to give people tax cuts and more handouts at the same time. Well, in the short run, maybe that works, but sooner or later, you keep doing that, you're greased. So Trump is strange. I can't think of another way of describing it.
Well, I didn't ask about Trump because I know maybe we should do just an interview just for him. But yeah, you got the good point. The last question, because I don't know a lot of American people, but I think it would be like my favorite country ever. Sometimes I hear that America is an experiment, and this kept into my mind, like, what does it mean? Can you explain it to me? Why America is an experiment? It's an experiment for what? For the capitalism, for individual liberty, or maybe both things, no?
Well, I guess the honest answer to that is that the experiment in the United States is frankly not that different from the experiment in other Western societies, because the rule of law evolved out of Europe. And when Europeans came to North America, they basically brought that concept with them, which I think is the greatest cultural and historic legacy of European society. But Ronald Reagan always used to say that what made America different is that it wasn't founded on the basis of a common ancestry. It was founded on the basis of a common ideal. And if you look at the Constitution of the United States, there was something special about it. A constitution specifically designed to put handcuffs on government, to limit the power of government, to maximize, hopefully in perpetuity, the individual freedom of the American people. Now, is there a bit of maybe exaggeration in that? Was Reagan maybe just playing to the patriotic impulses of the American people? Yeah, maybe there was some of that, but I also think there's some truth to it that our Constitution really was different. It represented a break from the former societies. I mean, there's always been this standard joke that in America the operating presumption is you're free to do something, whereas in other societies the operating presumption is, will the government allow me to do it? Now, obviously, that's overstated and exaggerated, but there might be something to it. So maybe there is something about the American culture. We see it, I think, in polling data. I've seen some of this data where you ask in different European countries, is it government's responsibility to provide you with healthcare, with housing, with jobs, and most Europeans, or at least in most European countries, people say yes, it's government's obligation to do those things. In the United States, at least historically, people would always say, no, it's not government's job to do that. It's my job to do that as a free individual. Now, do I think that that principle of self-reliance is eroding in America? Yes, I worry about that a lot. So I guess answering your question is it's difficult to give a perfect answer, but there is something to the idea that the United States is a different type of country.
Well, more or less to finish, I don't know if in Spain, here there's some libertarian authors that they say that some part of the foundation of the United States comes from the Spanish Scholastics, because some of the founding fathers, such as John Adams or Jefferson, they were reading the books from the golden century, that they were like somehow proto-libertarians. I don't know if you ever heard that.
I've seen a couple of articles on that. I don't have enough expertise. I'm not a history of thought expert at all. So I know that the Spanish Scholastics, the Enlightenment thinkers, that there were many threads that sort of came together. And of course, inside the United States, when the U.S. was being founded, we did have our own debate between the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians, but somehow it all came together with a constitution that was designed, I think, on a very good, honorable, moral premise that people should be free and that government should be limited.
Well, I can agree more. Daniel, I don't have more questions. We've talked about many different topics, and I see you're an expert in very different topics, and at least to me it has been very interesting, hopefully for some video that is also watching this video. So I don't have more questions. I don't know if you want to add something.
Well, I guess the only thing I'll add is that every day I write a column at my blog, which is called Internal Liberty. Easy to find any search engine. Just type in Dan Mitchell blog, and you'll find it. And every day I write about this international laboratory, this experiment that we call the world, and I write about why some countries are growing faster and why some countries are growing slower. And so I would very much welcome any of your viewers to stop by, visit my blog, get the free daily email with my daily columns. Again, our side, our only chance of prevailing is to educate more and more of our friends and neighbors about why, as a utilitarian matter, if you care about the poor, you should promote free markets and small government. And then hopefully we'll also convince them that there's a moral reason to favor individual liberty.
Well, hopefully we achieve that. I like this concept, this idea, the world as a laboratory. And in a way, I'm trying to do my best making these interviews and providing with new information to our viewers. So this has been everything in this interesting interview to Dan Mitchell. And for you, the viewers and followers, remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notifications button so you'll receive the news. And we will leave all the links from Dan Mitchell in the description. So Dan, see you next time, and thanks for being here with us.
All right, well, thank you.
Bye.